listeners, thanks for joining us again. It's great to be broadcasting again with a new special guest. This episode is called "Breaking Through the Bureaucracy: Clearing the Path to Entrepreneurship" with Marc Cabrera. Very excited to have Marc here today. Here on this podcast today, we will be covering a whole bunch, but more specifically, what is the biggest thing holding back you from launching your business? Is it paperwork? Today, we're going to be unpacking all of that, how to really handle all the administrative fogs that really can lead entrepreneurs to stall out, get frustrated, potentially not capitalize on their ideas that might be brilliant ones. So we're really going to get the real life perspective of what it really takes to make that move out of the corporation. So excited to have Marc on today. Marc has actually spent decades helping businesses across multiple industries, from coaching founders to advising executives. He knows how to turn complex business processes into clear steps, and wanted to kick it over to Marc for a brief introduction on himself and all the amazing experiences that he shared that we'll be diving into in detail today.
Great. Thank you, Frank, for having me on the podcast. Such an enjoyable event. And I happen to love this topic because I think especially across social media platforms today, there's a big call for the movement out of corporate. It's, start your side hustle, start your own business. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs kind of get stuck with that. What's that first step? So looking forward to our conversation. My own journey is not that of a typical entrepreneur. I studied finance and accounting in college and got into investment banking because I saw it as a kind of tried and tested way to work hard and make good money. It wasn't until I had already been in banking for about 15 years that I started my own side hustle, and that was a small education business. Not a big investment, but it was really the first step I took to learn this whole other, alternative universe of owning your own business. And then over the years, I kind of stepped that up. A number of years ago, I sold a business that I started with a couple of partners in the behavioral space, and we had a home run exit, and so it was baby steps leading to bigger stair steps, and so again, anxious to talk about it and see if some of my experiences may be helpful for folks considering a similar path.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, you definitely have a unique perspective, seeing really all sides of the table. And you probably have a great sense because of that of really what is holding people back. What is holding people back from, turning their ideas into businesses. So yeah, let's talk about that right there. Let's kick that off. What is the dream versus the dread, if you will?
My take is, and I think this is a fear that gets talked a lot about, but is often dismissed as kind of a conventional notion. It's the fear of failure, and the fear of failure, on some level, could be, well, I don't want to go for it and try to build a big company because there are a lot of implications for what that might mean in terms of your lifestyle, your commitment, your financial profile. But the reality is there's also the small fears along the way. So let's say, and this is my experience, investment banking is a sort of brutal grind in terms of the work-life balance. It's really tough to actually achieve any form of balance. I know you've been through it. Um, and when you think about, okay, I want to own a business on the side, or want to start a business on the side, how do I do that? How do I set that up? And even the small first baby step on the path can cause anxiety and just cause people to kind of freeze. And I've seen that with folks who are actually already in their own business. They may be working for someone else, but it's effectively their own business. And how do you essentially take that first step? And the first step is often really just setting up your own business entity. That is in my view, I remember the first time I did it. You file your, organizational docs, you get acknowledgement from the state that you've set your entity up in, then you've got to make some tax elections. And it's like, you're in business and you're a business owner at that point. And I'm a big believer in small wins to create momentum.
That's right. I say it every day. My employees can attest to that. It's really figuring out what are the one or two things I need to accomplish today in order to feel like the day was a win. And
Yeah.
if I could lay down 5 wins a week and 20 wins a month and do that for a year straight, the next thing you know, you're a winner. And you're going to save yourself time on the back end when you set yourself up the right way. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs do get what they call a paralysis analysis, and they get overwhelmed because there's five, six, maybe even a dozen things that they need to get to do. They don't realize that if they just break that thing down into 2 or 3 steps a week, or 2 to 3 steps a day per week, next thing you know, you can have a business stood up, you can have a website, you can have an LLC, you can set up a bank
Yeah.
account. And then from there, you're in good shape because now you have a place to guide clients to. Now you have, an email address to reach out to solicit new clients, and those are really the first steps. And oddly enough, they don't teach you that in college this day and age. Maybe in business school, I didn't have the benefit of going to business school, but maybe the school of hard knocks taught us well enough, I guess so. But even in investment banking, you get exposure to these types of things. But when you guarantee, if you stop bankers in the street and said, "Hey, how do you set up an LLC, or how do you do specific foundational structuring analysis, things of that nature," they might not actually know after having all that deal experience.
They may not. I mean, it's sort of taken for granted if you're working at one of the bulge bracket firms and, most of your clients are larger publicly traded companies that are in the S&P 500. The reality is most of the businesses in the United States and around the world are small, what are typically referred to as mom and pop businesses. It's the electrical contractor, it's the coffee shop owner, it's the parts distributor. Those businesses represent more than half of our economy. And I always love kind of seeing that as evidence that you can do it too. I firmly believe if you have an idea, great, take those first steps. I have another suggestion. Don't have an idea, set up an LLC anyway.
Yeah,
Use your initials, go through the steps. Something will come that you can fit into that LLC. I always keep a couple of LLCs on the shelf for that reason.
makes sense. And tell me about your first experience setting up your first LLC. What was like? What led you to do it initially? Was it an idea, or was it the hope of figuring out an idea? And then what did it feel like as you went through the process? And how has that experience kind of compounded over time as you've gotten into more formal enterprise and investments?
So the first LLC that I set up was to facilitate a small business acquisition, not necessarily small dollars for someone. In my case, it was about $50,000, and I was acquiring an education business. There were some unique circumstances driving the sale of that business. The business itself did several $1,000,000 of revenue. The way I looked at it was 50,000 was a very big investment for me at the time. But if it worked well, the return would be there. And if it didn't work, it wouldn't change my life. And I think a conventional or practical way to guide risk when you're thinking about doing something. You want to max out your credit card. I want to start this business. Great. Can you pay the credit card off if it doesn't work? What always gets me are stories where folks kind of go all in. They're taking a second mortgage on the house and they're doing this and they're really threatening their basic financial profile. Um, for me, it was a risk that I could afford at the time. I had to move quickly to acquire this business, and so I had to set up the business entity, elect the tax treatment of that entity, set up the financial systems, which I did using QuickBooks. Um, I had to set up a website. And in my case, there were additional things that most business owners have to deal with. I was bringing on a number of employees right away. So we had to set up a health insurance program. We had to set up some other things, payroll system. And I will tell you, my view is skip business school, set up a small business, learn about, your Form 940s, learn about, your co-pays, what's split between your health insurance premium between your employees and the company. Like, you'll learn everything you need to know about business setting that up. For me, at the time that I did it, this was a number of years ago. I didn't really understand what I needed to do. I had a lawyer that said, "This is what you need to do,"
Right.
and I've learned a lot, of course, since. And also at the time, everything was done, I think, by paper. You didn't have the option to file electronically the way you do today.
Yeah. I would also speak with some firsthand experience that, I think once you establish that initial list of what you need, this day and age, there's so many tools out there that make it pretty easy to set up things like payroll, bookkeeping. There's also just a no shortage of kind of work for hire from a contractor standpoint. Places like Upwork,
Absolutely.
great
Yep.
contractors, very low risk approach to getting quality work done. And once again, when you're getting kicked off initially, there's just so many little things to get into place. Not just the fundamentals of forming the entity and filing in the necessary states that you plan to operate in, but also just the little things like finding a bookkeeper and an accountant and someone to help you with hiring and things of that nature. So I do think now there's a much better ecosystem of business services out there than perhaps when you kind of were going down this journey for the first time.
It's a very, very different world. I think today you could the average person could set up 2 or 3 businesses that they operate from home.
Yep.
You can file your business entities, with your company. You're gonna take care of all the compliance. You can do it on the phone. You can essentially, purchase a subscription from QuickBooks online. Their sort of starting package for basic business is gonna work. It's well under $100 a month. If you don't know how to do bookkeeping, and I didn't, I learned owning that first business. You can go onto their expert network and find someone, and it's shocking what you can do if you didn't even want to get out of bed in the morning. You could just pop open your laptop, and you could build a business and operate it.
You can build a business from your bed. That's a
Yeah,
great tagline.
exactly.
But at the same time, getting started, feeling that sense of confidence of the momentum building is great. That's how I think all entrepreneurs want to feel as they accomplish their little wins every day. Have you ever been on the other end of it though, where you get a notice in the mail from the government or an email that says, "Hey, you're out of compliant," or a fine for perhaps an entity getting dissoluted unintentionally because you forgot to file?
All of the above.
All the above.
Yeah. Um, so just to give you a sense of how little I knew at the time, when I set up that very first entity, I didn't realize you had to refile or file annually, at least an annual report.
Right.
In this case, my entity was domiciled in the state of Florida. I sort of figured that out because I got a delinquency notice.
Mm,
I have also had, I got into the habit of using LLCs as a structure for creditor protection. So if I was purchasing even my own primary residence, I would purchase it through an LLC. It gives me some measure of creditor protection. Um, I think that's just smart business tactics today for even for
definitely.
personal from a personal finance perspective. But I remember I had an entity dissolved because I must have ignored or not seen the annual notice, and you get the delinquency notice, you don't do it, and you go and you check on the state website and you're like, wait a second, this is dissolved. And then you're almost I remember feeling embarrassed having to try to reinstate it because you're like, what kind of bonehead move was that?
Right. Yeah, but
Yeah.
I mean, realistically, each state has a different deadline. I mean, you're calling in today from Colorado. I'm sure, do plenty of business in Delaware from a formation standpoint. You used to live in Miami for some time, do a lot of deals down there in South Florida. Plenty of healthcare services stuff going on down there. So I'm sure you've kind of experienced the variance amongst the deadlines and then the rolling deadlines versus the fixed deadlines. Can you speak to that a little bit of how you'd guide someone to track those things?
I learned about Florida, which is where I set up Some of my first entities has a fixed annual report deadline. So does Delaware.
That's right.
Delaware is by far hosts the most business entities in the country. It's the go-to state for private equity formed LLCs and things like that. I have since formed a couple of entities in Colorado, and Colorado has an interesting timetable where, let's say, if I form the entity on April 21st, then my annual report is due April 21st a year later.
Yep.
So, depending on when you're forming them, you might have all these different deadlines.
Exactly.
Now, the state's pretty good about emailing you, assuming you put your email in their system, but
Hmm.
it is, on you as the entity owner to go ahead and make sure that you're in compliance, of course.
So at a certain point in your investment career or just building out your own personal portfolio, did you have just like a one of these crazy spreadsheets that just starts having a bunch of different dates and colors and business
Oh, that's
names and
way too organized, Frank.
you just had the willy-nilly emails come in and hope that it was a government agency?
It's a little bit more towards that level or organization. It was, I had LLCs for real estate investments that really weren't active LLCs. I've had investments in businesses that were very active. Um, a spreadsheet would have been a great idea. I think just sort of winged it. But it does highlight to me something that, has real consequences if you don't do it in an organized way. Now, looking back, probably got lucky, if I had to get an entity reinstated because I missed the annual report filing deadline, it wasn't a big deal.
Right.
Um, but I actually had a scenario where, in 2015, I set up a company with some partners in the behavioral health space. We started operations in 2 states right away. We had a Delaware holding company, we had a Delaware intermediate holding company, and we were, filing foreign, business entities in in North Carolina and in Florida. Well, we were also a healthcare entity, and so we had certain filings we had to do with various healthcare agencies. And when we went to sell that business 6 years later in 2021, buyer's counsel said, "Hey, do you realize that this license that you have in Florida is actually in someone's name? It's not in the entity's name." And that almost killed a very big deal for us.
Wow.
We had to scramble, and thank God one of our board members had a relationship with someone at the state, and they could, just to get us to closing within a 48-hour period, have that application essentially fixed. But it was, I didn't sleep for a couple nights when we found that out. And I use that, or I cite that as a lesson that, in my view, compliance isn't one and done. You set your entity up in 2025, you are constantly revisiting your articles, your minutes, whatever filings you have to do. That should be as organized as your accounting, as far as I'm concerned. I have, as you know, I spent a career advising sellers, mostly private company sales, and I can't tell you how many times we've gotten to within a couple weeks of closing. Uh, some business owners were ready to make, tens of millions of dollars, and there was some tax form that wasn't filed properly, or some other, um, you know, organizational document. And when you get to a stage where you're selling your business and there's a purchase agreement, there's a section of that agreement called fundamental representations. And those fundamental representations relate to your sort of tax status and liability and your organization. And what it means is, if something's off and you made a mistake, you're on the hook permanently. There is no protection through, a date or statute of limitations. So they seem like such small events when you're setting up the business, but they can have incredible downstream impact at the time that you want to, do a sale, take on private equity or something like that. So under I can't overemphasize how important it is to set this all up properly.
Yeah, and on that note, we can segue into some of the mistakes people make. I mean, setting up the Delaware LLC is one thing, but then operating in your local state is another thing. How do you guide folks that are either kind of getting off the ground or preparing for potentially a huge exit? How do you guide them to kind of stay on track?
I'm a big believer in not reinventing the wheel. There's, literally thousands of very smart lawyers who've kind of investigated various state regimes. And, as I said earlier, the sort of best practice today is to use an LLC entity in the state of Delaware. That's where most private equity firms set up their acquisition vehicles. Um, you know, I would counsel most business owners to model their organizational structure in the same way. Now you can get really fancy and use things like blocker entities that help with tax planning and things like that. But setting up a Delaware LLC is kind of a no-brainer. If you are going to deviate from an LLC, there should be a really good reason for that. I had this discussion recently with an entity founder. He wanted to set up as a C corp. There is the potential to offset some level of capital gains in a C corp. It gets quite nuanced in terms of the tax analysis. And my suggestion was, look, I'll tell you what the sort of conventional structure is. If you want to look at a C corp, let's get the right attorneys on the line and let's kind of talk this through. Because there could be downsides with a C corp as well, which is once you start issuing dividends, now you're subject to double taxation. So, um, you know, some of those early steps, the tax filing or tax treatment of your entity. Um, for example, let's say you set up an LLC and you have a couple of members of that LLC. You want to treat each other as partners, but you set it up as an S corp. You can do that, but you lose sort of the benefit of partnership accounting. There's some benefits in partnership accounting, and so you have to make that election upfront when you form your entity. So it's not that it is easy to do, but you've got to put some thought into it in terms of what's the vision for how you grow the business. Do you want the ability to take on investors down the road? Do you want the ability to sell it, and so on.
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. And I'd love to just ask a question that's kind of a little off the cuff here is just, in the healthcare space specifically, it's such a unique industry where there's so many clinics, right? There's a ton of
Mhm.
clinics. A lot of times they're operating across many, many states. A lot of times they're holding real estate, other times they're not, on their books. How do you typically see those types of firms kind of expand their footprint, kind of form LLCs in the various jurisdictions, and kind of stay compliant on that realm? How have you seen that unfold kind of naturally? And then now that you know that there's kind of solutions that kind of streamline this, how would you recommend they handle that going forward?
So best practices in uh, the section or segment of the healthcare industry that I think you're talking about, which is like the folks that are providing services. It could be a physician practice. It could be home health. It's when you think about what are the most numerous entities in the country, it's 10,000 home health agencies. It's a million doctors practicing mostly in small practice. It's 6,500 hospitals. So, state of the art or best practice in the healthcare industry is to set up an entity for each location. So, I've been an investor in medical practices, and the largest one that I was involved with, we had roughly 2 dozen offices in the Central Florida market, and so each office was essentially an LLC, um, and then that LLC role was, let's say, owned by an intermediate holding company, and that was the operating holding company. Then maybe above that, there was another entity, which was a Delaware LLC, which was considered the blocker. And then above that was a holding company where investors could sit in that holding company. Now, it sounds like a lot of work and administration. And again, businesses like yours really make that pretty easy. But in healthcare, you're dealing with things like litigation occasionally, things like that, and so best practice from a sort of risk profile management or risk management perspective is setting up each office within an LLC. This way, if there was some adverse event at one office, it didn't threaten all other, the other 23.
And who's kind of spearheading that effort within an organization like that? Is it the CFO? Is it the controller? Is it general counsel?
Most healthcare entities don't have general counsel. You'd have to be a pretty large entity to afford a really competent, industry specific general counsel. Of course, when you get to be sort of half a billion to a billion in revenue, when you've got dozens of locations, that could make sense. But as I said, most businesses continue to be in that kind of smaller domain. I mean, that is the bulk of the US economy today. And so, you're typically relying, if whoever is in charge of the finances, that could be a CFO, it could be a controller, it could be VP of finance, could be the business owner, it's him or herself. They may ask for filing guidance from their corporate counsel, like, "Hey, should I file as an LLC? What should the structure look like?" And I remember looking at these very elaborate PowerPoint presentations of how these things should be set up, and some entities are triangles and some entities are circles, and it looks very scientific. There's a lot of thought put into it, but the reality is you need that upfront thinking, but you don't necessarily need counsel to actually do the filing. That would be, I think, a kind of, poor use of corporate dollars to when you could use a file forms platform to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say some of the deal attorneys we used to use charge a pretty penny. And despite the fact that the legal bill comes back and it's a seven-figure invoice, all those little kind of billable hours do add up. And if you're spending a couple hours on government portals doing, the initial formation and then the foreign qualifications and electing a registered agent, that's a bunch of manual work that does take time on every individual government portal, and that lawyer is happy to charge
Yeah,
a full billable hour rate for that type of work.
that's true, and that's some private equity firms that I know, they have legal counsel, like very large firms do all that stuff because that is a better use of their dollars than the time they would put an associate to do that.
Sure.
But again, those are tend to be larger firms for most business owners, that are conscious of how they're spending, their time and money.
Yeah.
I think there are very cost-effective ways to do that today, rather than having counsel do all that busy work.
100%. Kind of segues us perfectly into, common pitfalls and government portals and, the typical vendor selection process, when you're thinking about, efficient use of capital and efficient use of budget, not overspending net on unnecessary administrative tasks, but then also, picking the right vendor. You don't want to look for something that's super inexpensive, but you get what you pay for, and
Right.
potentially even they drop the ball.
Yeah, look, I'll go back to what we were talking about earlier, which is that I think the broad opportunity that exists for people today that are interested in either setting up their own business as a side hustle, or maybe setting something up that they're going to gradually envision themselves stepping into full time. The reality is that a to set up a business entity, keep it compliant, set up a set of financials, books and records in QuickBooks, maybe set up a website and have that website hosted. I mean, all this can be done for well under a couple $1,000s. It's quite remarkable. Um, and I think that is really just amazing to me. And if you wanted to get fancy and hire someone to do, a custom logo, a little bit more spiffy website, now you're going to start spending hundreds of dollars or maybe thousands of dollars. Um, but rather than having sort of the dollars dictate the outcome, I like to think about what is it that you're trying to accomplish from a business perspective.
Yep.
A lot of businesses today, they may not need a website. If you're if you don't host a store on your website, and again, that's pretty easy to do with a service like an AWS. But a website a lot of times can be just a landing page and an about me or the company, because most of your business is done either in a retail environment or an industrial environment. So I wouldn't go crazy overspending on a website. But what I would do is think about some of the other marketing channels that you might have access to. I mean, I know when I've looked at it, I get overwhelmed pretty easily. The ability to link, let's say, marketing content across Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, um, TikTok, and the state of the art today is to have kind of cross channel content that gets repurposed, um, some very sophisticated analytics around sales and marketing, customer acquisition costs, lifetime value customer, things like that. Some of those things can be incredibly rewarding in terms of return on investment. And I would rather spend the time and money on something like that than a $10,000 or $5,000 website.
Yeah. I always like to say, try to make every move revenue generating. And that's not always possible, but if it's even one or two derivatives from revenue generating, it could be the right move. And a lot of times, once again, there's so many different things to do. Prioritizing and force ranking the to-do list every day is a good use of time, because you might quickly realize there's a few moves you can make or prioritize sooner, which will get you to that revenue moment earlier. And I think, that first dollar in a lot of times is the inspiration that that entrepreneur needs to keep going. Because I've found you need a lot of endurance to be a good entrepreneur, and to really take an idea and push it through the process of becoming a business and all of these steps that we've been talking about. And Yeah, prioritizing what is needed in order to get that win is definitely the right next move, because otherwise you could run out of budget.
You could, and again, I'll go back to, I think the good news is today, setting up your business entities, keeping them compliant, filing, your FinCEN, beneficial owner reports, things like that. All the things that you're taking care of for us. Setting up QuickBooks, maybe a basic website with a landing page, but maybe investing in a couple of other, um, sort of digital assets, whether that's a little spiffier banner on your LinkedIn profile, whatever it is. I think the things that can fall through the cracks today are lack of continuity. Um, so even if you said, I'm not going to invest in a logo, but I'm going to make the font of my company's name the same across all my social media platforms, I'm going to use the same font, things like that.
Yeah,
Um, all the things that don't directly relate to driving revenue are remarkably easy and efficient today. And I think that is a huge opportunity. I think business owners, again, going back to your very first question, what is that fear of failure? You can get mired in all these things that don't relate to revenue or building, your customer base or your client base. And I think if you said, what's the bare minimum I need to do to set up and be in business? Let me do that and let me focus on landing that first client. If you're a coach, if you're a, speaker for hire, if you're something like that, you don't need an office. But if you have a legal entity, you have a consistency in terms of your email signature, your contact on your landing page or your website, maybe your fonts and colors. As long as you come across as, hey, I'm operating from a home office, but I'm a business owner, I'm fully compliant. I know what I'm doing, and all the time that I spend is really serving my clients. I love that message. I think it's a very powerful message.
definitely. I got to ask, what led you to kind of escape the corporate structure, and then what led you to start kind of business coaching, and then I have a follow up, but we'll start
Sure.
there.
I fell into becoming a business owner because of this one opportunity to invest in the educational space. Uh, what I didn't come to appreciate, which I've seen a lot of my clients over the years in investment banking were private company owners. And the one thing that always impressed me about most of them was they created the lifestyle that they wanted. Um, there are lots of benefits to owning your own business. The folks that I met and dealt with, they had certain things. It could be vehicles, it could be memberships, it could be other things that they used for both business and personal reasons, and they would write off, some of those expenses. It just struck me that a lot of these business owners had the ultimate flexibility that a wage earner really doesn't have. And I've been a W-2 income earner for decades, so I know what that's like. So there's some tax benefits. There's some other things. There are retirement vehicles that a business owner can set up, like a SEP IRA, and other things that are specific to being a business owner, where you can put disproportionate amounts of annual earnings into a tax advantaged vehicle. Um, I figured that out with that first business. It was like, we set it up, the business was running, and then we were like, okay, well, I had a partner in that business, and I said, well, let's take a distribution, and we just sent ourselves the money from the bank account. Um, and there's all these things that you realize it's just a very different experience of earning a return on your time and investment when you're an owner, the owner or an owner in that entity. So I got kind of hooked. The other thing that was not lost on me at all was if you have a business entity and you sell it, the tax treatment of that sale is dramatically better than the tax treatment of any distributions you might make, or being, again, in comparison, a W-2 income owner. So the returns, that sort of tax advantage of being an owner and then selling and earning a gain that way was fantastic.
And it sounds like you really kind of sought this out through your experience on your own accord rather than having a job teach you this. It was kind of almost like learning through osmosis versus learning it in school, or, hey, this is how you set up an LLC and this is what you do next to open a bank account.
I mean, I can't imagine someone's gonna go to Wharton and sign up for a class, and with how much the tuition is there, and this is what's gonna be covered. I think they'd have a revolt on their hands. They're gonna wanna talk about very arcane finance theory and, super sophisticated capital structure analysis. This stuff's really basic, but it's remarkable how many, business owners don't focus on it because it's not common knowledge. A lot of times, the most effective lesson you learn is also because you made the most horrible mistake, like you have an entity dissolved, and that entity holds your healthcare license, and that healthcare license is what allows you to essentially get reimbursed for your services. Like
Right,
it can turn ugly quickly.
right.
Um, and so I think, yeah, this stuff is for most people probably kind of basic and potentially even boring, but it's the basic building blocks that are required, in our kind of US paradigm, legally, commercially, financially, to set these entities up so that you have flexibility in the future.
I agree 100%. If you had to guess how many hours you spent throughout the course of your awesome career doing this type of compliance work, what would you have to guess? Like maybe even just a
Or
yearly
I don't know
estimate.
if I want to guess. I might bring up some former, bad experiences,
Nightmares.
make me relive them, but I still deal with it today. A couple years ago, I set up an investment vehicle. I did it in the state of New Mexico. There's some benefits for doing it there. I've spent a good amount of time on the former registered agent that I used in that market in Albuquerque, and it's as you said, whether it's spending time on the phone with an agent, an attorney, uh, trying to make it through a government portal. There's no reason to spend the time doing that. I know what my best and highest use is these days. It's generally not on
Right.
the administrative stuff. And even with my sort of accounting, right? I have a couple of entities where I have an outside bookkeeper. Now I can go in and I can check a journal entry or go through the general ledger, but my best and highest use is reviewing, not inputting.
Right. No doubt. And I guess with that, we talked a lot about the structural components of running a business and all of that, but there's also plenty of people components, building culture, finding great teammates. Any kind of words of advice as you've kind of navigated that side of your entrepreneurial journey or working with businesses?
One of the I think best practices for most business owners, if you want to sort of take advantage of the best that your talent, whether it's partners, colleagues, staff, have in them, give them a little piece of ownership. That can be in an LLC structure. That can be through something called P units. I won't get into the sort of nitty gritty, but there are very tried and tested structures that will give folks an opportunity to participate in the success of the business alongside of you, and that is I've sold over 100 companies, the largest of which was over $1 billion. These were entities owned by people, not big corporations or big funds. And I've seen the types of financial rewards that can be returned to entrepreneurs who really go for it. The difference generally has to do with the talent of the employee base, the management team, things like that. So I know when we sold our behavioral health asset in 2021, we had roughly 190 employees. We had a full management team. Every single employee in the company got a bonus
Wow,
in that sale.
that's a lucky group, and I'm sure they
They
greatly
deserved it.
valued it. Yeah, yeah. Culture's everything. Um, awesome. Well, this was great. I guess in closing, any tools or services you'd like to recommend to listeners out there?
Look, you mentioned there's lots of platforms out there. I have been very pleased with how easy it is to use some of these basic, you know, systems like QuickBooks, file forms. Um, to secure talent. There are platforms I've used Fiverr in the past. I want to give a shout out to a buddy of mine, Elijah Saz at Spark Six. He does custom operating systems, logo work. He's been a business partner of mine. He doesn't show up anywhere, but all his stuff is sort of behind the scenes, making me look better, making me perform better. So he's been a recent go-to partner of mine.
Awesome. And lastly, can you just speak to some of the listeners out there who want to learn more about your coaching and things like that? What kind of entrepreneurs do you typically work with, and how do you help them?
Sure. So my sole platform today is LinkedIn. If you are interested in chatting, hit me up with a DM on LinkedIn. I have spent over 30 years working with high performing CEOs, business owners, institutional investors. Over that period of time, I've distilled kind of what are the best practices for folks. Sometimes they're small, silly things, like filing your annual report is kind of a small, silly thing when you think about it,
Yeah,
but it can get you in trouble down the road
it's
when it
true.
comes time to sell. But I tend to work with folks that are looking to, I will say, generically level up from where they are today.
Hmm.
And so that might be, hey, I've had a great career, but I want to start a company and do this. And I've done a lot of work with folks that come out of and have fantastic industry experience, but they want to flip from that W-2, salary plus bonus compensation structure to actually being that business owner. And so how do you take that step? There's a psychological leap of faith that takes place in that, but there's also some of the basic steps you and I have covered today.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think, one of the biggest pieces having someone to go on that journey with you. Whether it's a vendor who grows with you as your business expands from formation in one state to multiple states, or even a business partner who has been there and done that, or a coach like yourself who's kind of seen the different perspectives around the table. They know what an exit feels like. They know what getting a loan feels like. They know what setting up QuickBooks feels like, using file forms, what have you. So, having good people, good guidance, good vendors, good technology is a big part of running a successful business and doing it efficiently. Because when these little things
Absolutely.
add up, it could ruin days on end. That kills momentums. Now you're not getting the wins, and now got a bunch of cleanup on your hands. So we really feel like we can help people stay on track. And yeah, with that, thank you again. Thank you so much for joining, Mark. It was a really interesting conversation. I think listeners will definitely find this valuable and hopefully inspirational to kind of take that leap and dive right into turning their businesses into big businesses, and hopefully businesses that have huge exits someday.
I hope so. I mean, my goal was to certainly, hopefully, incite a little bit of enthusiasm and hope that if I can do it, I think anybody can do it. It's remarkably easy today, and so that shouldn't be the thing that stops you.
Definitely. Definitely. Well, thanks so much, Mark. We'll hopefully have you up here again soon and we'll cover more topics. But that's all for today, folks. Thank you so much.
I would love to do that. Thank you again, Frank.
Awesome. Thanks.